be that Pharaoh, then I'm gonna be that Moses. They don't wanna see us shine, cause when we do, it exposes. So I'ma keep speaking till everybody knows us. It's when we turn the truth that we see where the flow is.
You know the way, that's what they say. That's why I pray to shine like the day. So take this life, make it right. Take this life, make it light to see.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Piper Hendricks, and I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you have joined a webinar before, you know that we welcome you with a song as you log in. This is the first time we've ever had the singer and the speaker be the same person. I will introduce Pedro in just a moment. First, I want to share that Stories Change Power equips people to be effective, empathetic, and trusted advocates. In addition to coaching, customized workshops, and our learning communities, we do that through short courses, like the 4-week ethical storytelling course that we're offering mid-June and into July. From initial outreach to revocable consent, you'll learn how to infuse dignity into every step of your storytelling, whether that's as an individual or as an organization. We still have a few spots open then, so register soon, and we'd love to see you. You'll find more about all of our offerings on our website, and be sure you're staying looped in with us on LinkedIn. 4 quick reminders before we dive in. 1, we've got the captions enabled, so please use those if they're helpful to you. Second, the chat is open for constructive conversations among our human friends only. What I mean by that is that AI is welcome to watch the recording, but not welcome on the webinar itself, and we will not include the chat in the recording that we share later. Third, put your cues, your questions in the Q&A. You'll see a little box at the bottom of your screen, and that just makes it easier so they don't get lost in the chat. We may mention your first name, but we will not identify you by your full name, and you can always opt to be anonymous in your question if you prefer. Also, if we can't reach your question today, we'll aim to get to that on LinkedIn or in a newsletter coming up in the weeks ahead. As a webinar, you are off camera and your mic is off, so find that balance that's right for you of relaxing while also tuning in to the wisdom that Pedro is about to share. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Pedro Silva is the Director of Engagement at Unify, and Unify is a cross-sector initiative that is working to unite people from diverse backgrounds and industries to accelerate progress on key societal changes. Pedro is a United States Air Force veteran who later earned his Master of Divinity from Andover Newton Theological School and went on to serve as a pastor at the United Church of Christ, or UCC. With his background in intercultural and diversity studies, along with his experience studying Mandarin Chinese, he is able to communicate across a broad spectrum of perspectives and foster meaningful dialogue in really complex settings. He recently founded Higher Up Consulting, a coaching and facilitation practice that is designed to support individuals and organizations who are committed to living their ideals. And if that is not enough already to give you a sense of just how diverse and talented and dedicated Pedro is, I'll share that he also promotes connection and healing through humor and storytelling as the project director of the Liberation Comedy Project. Pedro, welcome. It is so great to have you here. And you're on mute. We want to hear you.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the intro.
Absolutely. It's a fun one. And thank you for the song. I'm going to be humming that all day. As
Yeah.
always, everybody, we like to hear a little bit more about who is on the call today so we can make this as helpful as possible. And so you will have a poll pop up in just a moment with 2 questions today. The first is our usual, wanting to know how long you've worked in advocacy. And as always, everybody is welcome no matter what field you're in, or maybe no field right now at all. And then the second question is, how important is storytelling to your work? And that if you are someone who is joining as a volunteer or a retiree, both, think of your work very broadly. With that second question, we're asking, is it extremely important, somewhat important, not important at all? And maybe stories you think don't relate to your work at all. So seeing some answers come in will give folks a few more moments to respond. We'll do a little countdown here, maybe 3, 2, And also, if you can't put your response in the poll, feel free to pop that in the chat. But I will go ahead and end the poll here. And then you should be seeing the results. It looks like, Pedro, we've got about a half of folks who are new here, many who are pros in advocacy, and a few who are somewhere in between or somewhere working in a different field. And great to see on our second question that when it comes to how important is storytelling to your work, a good 75% of people almost say it's extremely important. We've got a few somewhat important, and then a few that don't relate to their work at all. So thank you, everyone. That is really helpful. And with that, Pedro, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. So, all right, I want to make sure everyone can see my screen that says storytelling superpowers. Can I get a thumbs up or?
Yep. Verbal
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So today we're going to talk about how storytelling is a superpower and something that many of us take for granted. And I know that some people will say that they don't consider themselves storytellers, but I'm going to start off by submitting to you that every single person is a storyteller. There is no such thing as a person that's not a storyteller, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, whether it's full with artistry and imagery, or whether it's just talking about data. Every human being is a storyteller. And so with that as our foundation, I want to kind of present to you this notion of how our storytelling is a superpower for us. So starting off by saying that telling stories is an awesome responsibility. And the stories that we share about who we are, who others are, they can either serve or sever our world. And sharing a story, as I said, it's an awesome responsibility that too many of us take for granted. And what I want to invite us into today is this awareness that the best stories create space and the worst stories erase. And so we can put those into those categories of stories that serve and stories that sever. Spaciousness is serving, erasure is severing. So I'm going to tell you how I first became aware of a storytelling as a superpower. When I was really young, I was hanging out with my cousins and my brother, and we were just kind of joking each other. And at some point, I decided to make up some goofy story about my younger brother, and it was completely untrue. And I said it just to be funny. And then everyone laughed, and my brother said, "No, that's not true. That's not true." And I was like, "Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is," trying to just kind of joke. And then some weeks or months later, I heard my brother telling the same story and saying that he did the thing that I lied and said he did. And then I said, "No, you didn't really do that, man. I was just joking. You didn't do that." And he swore that what I had said was true. And I was like, "No, it wasn't true." And with that first instance has endured my entire life, because I saw in this one little moment in my life how something I said had a power over somebody. And even though I didn't understand what that power was, because I had unintentionally harmed my younger brother, and then he took on the harm that I had put on him as a reality. It terrified me, honestly. It terrified me that that could happen. And I started to be very mindful of everything I said and became hyper vigilant of trying to be as accurate as possible in my storytelling. And when we get a little bit deeper into the conversation and taking the ideas of storytelling as a superpower a little bit more deeply, we'll talk about how in the narratives of superheroes, which are basically the mythology of the times that we're in now, that every story has a point where the person awakens to their superpower. And I'm hoping that today will be the day that you awaken to yours. So, narrative arc. So getting into the superhero piece just a little bit, every superhero or every person that you see as a hero in any kind of narrative, they always have an origin story, and it's where they came from, what shaped their values or lack of values, and it is their origin story. It's like, this is where I came from. This is where I figured out what was important. And then at some point in most stories that I've seen, there's some kind of awakening that happens. There's some kind of turning point. Like with Spider-Man, his uncle Ben died. And prior to that, Uncle Ben had said to him, hey, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. But he wanted to just play around with the powers that he had been gifted and wasn't trying to take any responsibility. But then when his uncle died at the hands of someone that he had the opportunity to stop earlier, that recurring theme of that awakened him, and then he did not want that recurring theme to happen again. And so that became the injustice became his nemesis. Like, I try to avoid making people enemies or nemesis or nemesi. I don't know what the plural nemesis is. However, in our lives, we do tend to come across recurring obstacles throughout our lives that basically show us where we've gone and how far we've traversed on our own narrative arc, our own story of who we are and who we are becoming. And so, as storytellers, if we are mindful of the superpower, we also are witnessing the unfolding of our story, of who we've been, who we are, and who we're becoming. And when we are mindful of it, we can look at the recurring themes that may happen or the obstacles, and we can re encounter those stories every time and hopefully mark progress and evolution in our own story journey. And then another part of the narrative arc is that, generally speaking, people who are aware of their power also develop a mission orientation, which all of you who are working in advocacy have some kind of mission orientation. Everything that I've said about story development and about superheroes are true about you as well. You've all had an origin story. There's all been a point where you woke up, maybe you work in the service of the planet, and at some point you had some experience that let you realize or led you to realize the criticality of our planned situation right now. And so you had that awakening, and then that recurring obstacle of people abusing the planet um, got to you. And so you decided you're going to work to prevent that or minimize that. And that's a part of your mission orientation, your larger purpose that fuels your action and your story. And I don't know if I'll be able to see the chat, but if you can give some kind of indication or thumbs up in the chat if you can relate to anything I'm saying. I'd love to see if you can relate to anything I'm saying. All right. Next is reflection. So I wanted you to just take a moment. Obviously, we're not engaging in real time where you can hear my voice and I can hear your voice, but I want you to reflect on these questions of what's a defining moment that shaped your view of the world. When did you realize that your story could help or harm others? And then what challenge keeps showing up in your life that you feel called to face? And then who or what are you trying to protect or serve? So, because I know myself more than I know anyone, I'll give you some examples, but then I invite you to um, take these questions, and I'll probably put them in the chat later or send them through Piper. But take these questions so that you can have time to reflect on them. But I know that besides the story I told you about the lie that I told about my brother when I was young, that made me hyper vigilant about how I told stories, I also came from a very multicultural background. My dad's an immigrant, hence the name. My mother is an African American person, but with roots in the Caribbean. And when I grew up in the South, where there was not a lot of diversity beyond you're Black American or you're white American, and the tensions that existed and still exist in throughout our country, but they were very pronounced back when I was growing up. But because of my name, people wanted to know my origin story, and so they would say, "Well, why do you have that name? Where'd you come from? What are you?" Those kinds of things, and I really just experienced myself as a Black American, but other people experienced me as something else because of my name and because my dad and I, when I was younger, I spoke a different language. So those sorts of things had people create stories about me. And I wanted them to know me as me, not as the story that I made up. And I witnessed so many times where people would be projecting a story onto me as a young Black man And then I would watch when they heard my name. I could tell when the story started to change and they went from having whatever limited story that they came up with to becoming curious about me and wondering about me. And then if they were able to make space for me by creating a different story that they made up based off of my name. So they might have created a more expanded story out of curiosity. They would make more room for me that they wouldn't make for other people. And then they would use those same justifications as reasons to exceptionalize me so that they can hold on to the other narrative that they had about people that I related to, but then make room for me. And we see that happen a lot in our societies because we are often bound to narratives that were handed down to us. And we have the struggle to let go of those narratives to actually encounter people face to face. And I decided that I didn't want to do that. What I experienced, I didn't want to project onto other people. And so I worked to maximize my curiosity. Like one of the things I do is if I see something that I'm completely not interested in, like books or anything like that, I will read a book about something that I have completely no interest in just because I don't want to uh, minimize someone to the limited narrative that I have. So, for example, I went through a phase where I read um, romantic novels that were from the Amish people, the Amish community. And I went through, it was a very interesting experience, but I read a whole series of Amish romance novels just to get a sense of that community that I would probably never otherwise get connected to. And that prevented me from projecting something that with my limited capacity, I expanded my capacity. I made space, a story that served. So I created stories that served within myself by reading stories from another community and expanding myself so that if I ever do come across someone from the Amish community, I can say, hey, I know what Rumspringa is, and just kind of go deeper. And so this is part of the invitation is as you encounter the stories that have shaped you, being curious enough both about the stories that shape you, but about the stories that shape other people, and create more space, more serving space within yourself to be able to hear stories that you might not be able to hear if you already have preconceived notions. So a little bit more into the stories that serve. So they usually will expand our sense of connection and possibility. I experienced that very deeply. Also, not to make this a Pedro storytelling story, but it's I think it's important to know our stories and why we do what we do. And part of my story is the public library. Running from bullies when I was younger, I ran into the library because no one wanted to go in there, and I started reading lots of books. And later in life, I discovered when I became an adult that reading those books had expanded the narrative within me that I started to see connections that I might not have seen otherwise, and also possibilities. I'm doing some civic work right now and trying to help Boulder Valley with their comprehensive plan, and there are a lot of people who have an old narrative about what that means. And so in their minds, they still imagine that the comprehensive plan means what it meant 50 years ago, even though the process has changed. And they cannot see many people can't see possibilities because they already have an old narrative that is in front of them. So our work is to serve them by creating greater senses of connection and help them see more possibilities so that the community can build upon itself in positive ways. Also, they help more people see themselves as consequential to the stories unfolding. Many people who feel disempowered, um, they cannot locate themselves in the larger narratives. A lot of their stories are so confined that whatever was projected onto them at an early age or whatever they witnessed can make their stories so small that they're grounded in survival and not in thriving or flourishing, which is other work that we are working in. And when I say we, I mean Unify. But people cannot locate themselves in the story. And so when they can't locate themselves in the story, everything becomes diminished. Everything has a diminished capacity. How I got into comedy actually is an interesting story. I was working on a project that was related to the environment, and I was calling disenfranchised people, poor Black, brown, and rural white people, and was contacting them to see if they felt that their um, community was being served and if they were getting good representation from their government officials with regard to the environment. And I called one woman, and this was from my community where I grew up in Virginia. I was calling into that community. And the woman, when I asked her about the environment, she said, I don't care about the environment. And I was kind of stuck. She said it worse than that. I'm saying it very gently, but she said I don't give a blank about the environment. And then I said, well, what about future generations? And she said, I don't give a blank about future generations either, and which really shocked me. And then she said, this planet has not been good to me. I haven't had a good experience, and I don't care if it burns. And that was startling, and it shook me. And I still had like 1,000 more calls to make, and that's not an exaggeration, which we can talk about exaggeration later. And so I was very shaky after, and I didn't want to talk to other people. And so I had to work with it. And so I sat with that feeling and I asked myself some questions, and I was like, why would she say that? Where was it coming from? And it hit me, well, I can understand if a person can't locate themselves in a story, then they feel inconsequential. If they feel inconsequential, then the whole world's going to feel inconsequential. And so I decided to make a comedy set about whether poor Black and brown people and indigenous people should care about the environment after how so many people experienced being on this planet. And I won't get into the whole story, but I made a video about it, and maybe I'll share that as well. But locating oneself in the story is very powerful for transformation, and that's what stories that serve do. And they also create bridges between perspectives, promoting our shared humanity. And often when we talk to folks about connecting across differences, we try to point them toward shared values and their humanity, because a lot of times people have similar values, and it's just the way that they try to demonstrate those values are different. And when they don't um, connect and share values, and they have what seems like competing stories, then that's where people have problems. Some folks, they have this idea that another person's story is a threat to their story. And so if they internally feel, if you exist, how can I exist? Because some part of their story has made the other folks enemies. And if you're ever inclined to have me do some kind of presentation that focuses on some of why people get into that mindset, will share something about Rene Girard. But right now, while I have you online, I do want to invite you to look up Rene Girard, where he talks about scapegoating and why people do it, and how many cultures build their own narrative on he calls it the founding murder. And it's, who did we have to get rid of so that we could be a people? And many cultures are born out of that space. It's very difficult to realize that humans repeat that pattern so much. But if we get better at creating bridges between perspectives and promoting shared humanity, and realizing that there are overarching narratives, what can be called the superordinate story, if you're into the work of Marshall Gantz, that can include more people. And that's what we want to do when we do stories that serve. We all are probably experts in stories that sever, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on stories that sever, but it's very obvious what severing means. And so stories that sever, they divide and exclude. They assign disproportionate value to some lives over others. They reinforce systems of hierarchy and dehumanization, and they shrink possibility by flattening complexity into us versus them. So I want to take a moment just to engage and ask folks to put in the chat, why do you think that we create so many stories that sever? And see if a couple of folks want to answer that. But why do you think that humans create stories that sever? Yep, to protect our identities, absolutely. Fear, we need to protect our views. It makes them feel better, us and them binary. Yeah, all of those things. Othering. So the first one I want to lean into is the protection of our identities. We see a lot of times in poorer communities um, that folks, when they have a certain narrative, it makes their world make sense. Like where I grew up, the context was such that folks who grew up with my background had a certain destiny. And in fact, I personally did not expect to live past 18. I was convinced that I would die before 18. The narrative that was shared with me and my community was that in the context I was in, that I was either going to be dead or in jail, and I knew I wasn't going to jail because if I did anything that was going to put me in jail, my mom was going to kill me anyway. So I assumed that death was probably my best outcome. And so part of the narrative that I created at that time, and gratefully I ended up having opportunities to recreate my narrative, which is something that we all can do at any moment if we choose. It might not be easy, but it is possible. And one of the ways that I was able to kind of contextualize the idea of where that I wasn't going to live past 18, but I didn't want to do anything that would put me in jail is I told myself I don't want my grandmother to be embarrassed at my funeral, because I happen to come from a very religious family. And as you know, I was a pastor for quite some time. And in the context of my family, uh, I'll just say that they were pretty sure they knew who was going where after this life. Let's just say it like that. And so they had no qualms about letting folks know at the funeral where they thought people were, which is not normal and probably abusive. But my family did that because they thought that it was a deterrent. And we don't have time to talk about this right now, but there is shame. The tool of shame is often used as a mechanism for social cohesion. And so that was one of the tools they used at funerals was for social cohesion, and in their mind to encourage everyone to stay on the straight and narrow. They would let folks know, well, you're never going to see this person again because this is the life they lived and this is where they are now, but there's still a chance for you, yada yada yada. And I was like, well, I'm not going to let that happen to my grandmother because I don't want her to die at my funeral if they say something about me. And so I contextualized my life and said, okay, if these are the stories that I've been told, what's the best outcome that I could come up with? And the best outcome I could come up with was live in such a way that your grandmother isn't embarrassed at your funeral. But I was also surrounded by severing stories everywhere, severing stories. And I'm really grateful that through different encounters and different things, I was able to see that those stories were not the ultimate stories. But if you've ever experienced, and I'm sure you have, stories that sever, stories that take you away from you, divide you in parts that don't um, line with the identity that you experience yourself as, and people who see your identity as a threat to their identity and those sorts of things, just maybe put something in the chat, or take a deep breath or a sigh if anything comes up for you. And even though I can't see you, I'm caring for you as I'm sharing these things. So TX stands for transmit. When I was in the military, I served as a satellite communications technician for my first enlistment, and we use TX for transmit. So these are stories that we tend to transmit that we are encouraged to take responsibility for. So the stories that you tell yourself about who you are, the stories you tell yourself about who others are, the stories you tell yourself about how you relate to others, and then the stories you tell yourself about the value of other people believing your stories. And these aren't all stories, these are not the only stories that we transmit, but these tend to be the core ones. And these are ones that I observed myself. So there's no book or anything. It's just me observing and paying attention throughout the course of my life and through the study of being a minister. And I studied to be a minister so I could get better at telling stories. And some of the things I observed were these tendency for people to tell these kinds of stories. And the ones I think is the most important is the story you tell yourself about who you are, because that tends to color how you see the rest of the world. Um, by way of imagery, I would say that the story you tell yourself about who you are is like the glasses through which you see the world. And so if you have really dark stories that you tell yourself about who you are and you put those on, you're going to see in the world the darkness that you will be projecting because of the stories you tell yourself about who you are. If you can tell yourself better stories about who you are, then those will end up impacting the stories you tell yourself about who others are, the stories you tell yourself about how you relate to others, and then also the stories you tell yourself about the value of other people believing your stories. Because oftentimes we need validation from other people, or we believe that we need validation from other people, and we limit what we can receive about ourselves or what the stories that we tell we're looking for validation from somebody. And most of us, even into adulthood, still hold a desire to have someone validate, and it maybe someone that serves as a proxy for someone that didn't validate when we were younger. And it's important to know that we are experiencing life that way. So these are just some invitations to be mindful of the stories that we're transmitting. Then the stories that we receive, RX stands for receive. So why is it important for this person to believe the story they're telling me? So often when we get into conversations across differences in particular, as I said earlier, we're all storytellers. So even when someone's telling us something, we're inside of our heads half the time. I say half, but probably more, telling ourselves a story about the story that the other person's telling us. And so we kind of miss out on the stories that we're receiving. So these are some invitations to be mindful of how you receive stories. And so the first one, why is it important for this person to believe the story they are telling me? It's a powerful question. I know once every not every year, but very frequently on Easter when I was serving communion, someone would come through the line and tell me that they were Jesus. And I would go, "What? Another one?" So I met several Jesuses when I was a pastor. And one Easter, this man, I was giving him the bread of life, you say, in our tradition. And then he was like, I don't need it. And then I said, okay. And then I looked at him and he stared at me. He was like, I am it. And then at first I thought he just meant, some kind of holistic spiritual thing. And then he was waiting for me after church and he started talking to me and he was telling me all these things about Jesus. And then eventually he said, and can I tell you one more thing? I said, sure. And then he said, I am Jesus. And I said, oh, okay. And then he told me a few more things. And I asked myself, why is it important for this person to believe the story they're telling me? And so I was asking myself that question while he was continuing to tell me things. And then eventually he was like, just like, so do you have any questions? And I said, yeah, how do people normally respond when you tell them that you're Jesus and all the things that you just told me? And he said, no one else ever let me say this much before. And that was like, which was very interesting. Another question is, why is it important to this person that I believe this story that they're telling me? So when people tell you a story about who they are or their experiences or whatever the case may be, it's very important sometimes for you to be believed, even for you to believe their story, even when the people are lying. I've found that people will be lying to me and knowing they're lying, and still they find it important that I believe them. And later, when I find out they were lying, and I'll say, "Why did you lie? And why did you make such a big deal about it when you knew you were lying?" And they would say things like, "Well, I didn't want you to think that I was a lying person," but I'm like, "But you are lying. So why is it important to you that I not think you're lying when you are lying?" But some people find it very important to be believed because they are shaping themselves and their identity. Because most of us, as I've encountered, we have ideas of how we want to be received. So why do I find this story difficult to believe? So if I'm encountering somebody, I'm receiving their story, but I'm like, I don't know if I believe this. I have to ask myself, why do I find it difficult to believe? Because they might be telling the truth. Maybe that guy was Jesus. I'll never know. If I find myself aligning with the story that I'm receiving, asking myself, why do I want to align with this story? Like, what does it say to my identity about my identity? So if someone says, "Oh, these people are terrible," and I'm like, "Yeah," and I have to ask myself, why do I want to align? What do I get out of aligning with this story? And then how would I show up differently if you have a real challenge with someone? How would I show up differently than I do now if I believe this story with the same conviction that they do? That's a tough one, especially when someone's sharing something that's really contradictory to how you experience yourself or the world. But for sake of engaging, if that's something you choose to do, because you don't have to do it, this is work that it would be helpful. But if you can't do it, you have to also care for yourself. And I don't have time to talk about boundaries and borders and all those other things, but that's a part of it. But asking myself, how would I show up differently if I believe the story of the same conviction, just to be curious, to stay engaged. So I want to check on time, but before we keep going. So can I get a time check real quick?
It's about
Future.
37 after, and we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Okay, awesome. So as we're starting to wind down, I want to share with you that many of our stories, a part of stories is an ending. Whenever we watch stories, we don't go to a movie and stay in there for the rest of our life. We go in there, we look for a beginning, a middle, and an ending, something that engages us, takes us throughout the narrative, allows us to experience whatever the film is trying to take us to, and then it has an ending. And the same is true for our stories. All of us have an ending. And one of the endings that freaks us out a lot is death, which is on the horizon. And I know that's kind of a scary thing for some of us to contend with, but it is a part of our stories, and it's an inevitability. And there's this book that I want to recommend to you called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, who does a lot of work. And then there's also an offshoot of his work that talks about terror management theory. And the reason why I bring these up is because this ending of our story that many of us try to avoid, the reality of the ending of that story shapes how we engage our stories now. Because for those of us who cannot, I'm not trying to focus on death in particular, but I'm trying to uh, communicate that every story has an ending. And if we are stuck in our ending that is maybe based in fear or anything like that, it will shape every action that we take in the day-to-day stories that we tell, the stories that we receive, whether we tell stories that serve or whether we tell stories that sever. All of those are impacted by the vision that we have for the future. So if a person has a vision for the future that goes out many, many generations, and they see themselves, they've been able to locate themselves in the extended narrative of the human species, then they will live very differently than someone who is only thinking about how do I survive till tomorrow. And that's why it's very incumbent upon us to try to create systems that invite people to locate themselves in the story, because then they would be able to invest in a shared future of our species and the planet. When we don't have stories like that, then we see what we're witnessing right now. So again, what we believe about the future shapes how we tell stories now, but not just how we tell them, but also how we receive them. I know plenty of people that I've encountered in my life that they hear stories in the worst possible way. No matter no matter what is said, they will transform that story into a tragedy. And largely that's because their vision for their future isn't one that's full of possibility and hope. So the question to ask yourself is, are we telling stories from fear or from possibility? And ideally, if we create stories from possibility, then we're able to live in such a way that creates more space, as we talked about earlier. One of the things I'm working on right now is a concept actually that I'll share just briefly as a future informed indigeneity. And the idea behind future informed indigeneity is that some of us will choose to locate and ground ourselves in a future that matches the highest of possibilities, and that will be the ground from which we emerge, the ground from which we tell stories, the invitations that we choose to be. in the world, because some people, they just can't imagine a different world. And so they keep repeating the same stories over and over again. That's why it's very important for artists to be embedded in every system that we create, I personally believe, because they are able to give imagery to things that are not yet as if they are now. And through that, people are able to create better possibilities. Like, thank God for Star Trek, and and hopefully we'll someday get to a place where we can become explorers and poverty will be eradicated, and we'll get some stuff together and only fight people in outer space. I'm just joking. All right. So, just a final analysis. People who believe the future is closed tend to tell stories of scarcity, division, and control. People who believe the future is open tend to tell stories of curiosity, connection, and creation. Our vision orientation determines how we interpret other people's stories, as I said earlier. And then the question is, do we hear the stories as threats, invitations, warnings, or blueprints? I can tell you many, many, many stories throughout my life where I've said things from a place of possibility, because once I accepted the fact that I was not dead and that I made it past 18, I felt like all these possibilities opened up to me, and I took off. I joined the military and I took off and started to see a bigger world and learned Mandarin and all these other experiences, and was just deeply in gratitude. But I have encountered many people that, for lack of training, perhaps, they can hear a story that is an invitation and they'll hear it as a threat. So we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be mindful of if we're doing that, whether we intend to or not. Finally, this is just a tool. Not trying to put it on anybody, but I am becoming a certified Enneagram teacher in the narrative Enneagram tradition. And I just finished a course a couple weekends ago that was focused on how to help people determine some of what their potential type might be. If you don't know anything about the Enneagram, this is I had a homework assignment to come up with my own definition. So I'm just going to read that to you. And then if you do have any curiosity about that, my contact information will be shared later if you want to get in contact with me. But the Enneagram is a multidimensional roadmap for the human experience. It begins with 9 core frames of reference that may inform how you interpret the direction your life has taken. If we're lost within ourselves, the Enneagram helps us to locate where we are so that we can better navigate to where we desire to be, individually, relationally, and communally. Unlike many other systems, without judgment, the narrative tradition begins with core motivation as a starting point. It does not tell you where you should be. It largely helps you understand what your orientation, and it invites you to explore your inner landscape so that you can have more choice in where you can be. And I can tell you, just as a final story before we get into Q&A and everything, is when I first learned about the Enneagram, I said, okay, so what, who cares? And because they told me my type, and my type was a challenger, and I was not interested in something telling me who I was, because I'd had enough of that most of my life. And then, but I was in a ministerial program that was based in the Enneagram for leadership, and I was in it for 4 years, and it took the whole 4 years for it to convince me. And I didn't get convinced until the last teacher I had in that other program. She sounded so much like me that I was shocked, and we had nothing in common on the surface. She was a white lady, and came from a different background and all sorts of things, but everything she said sounded so much like me. And I said, man, this lady sounds a lot like me. And then when she said her type, I was like, oh wow. So then after that, I said, okay, it took a while, but I'm convinced. And then I eventually entered another program, also had an Enneagram component. So I felt like it was pursuing me. And so I decided to stop running from it and pursue it. So with that, I think that we're at time for the presentation, and we can move into Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pedro. I am absolutely blown away by the amount of information you shared. in such a short amount of time and in such a fun and caring way. I'm glad to have been on mute because you had me laughing many times, and also, just a lot of really thoughtful comments about the and insights into stories and how in the best case stories can create space and serve us, and in the worst case they erase and harm. And I want to dig in when you talk about curiosity. It strikes me that creates space, starting, it seems, in our own minds, and then beyond that for how we're defining ourselves and how we're seeing the rest of the world. And do you have tips for how people can get started with that curiosity, how to remember to be curious?
The main way I do it is I just tell myself I don't know. I make I don't know be my mantra. So even when like my kids, like I've been with them since the first moment they came into the earth. And when they do things that I don't understand, instead of making up a story about why they did what they did or whatever the case may be, I just ask them, and then I just say, "Well, why'd you do that? What?" And I don't say like accuse them. What were you thinking? I really want to know. I want to understand. Like, what were you thinking? Like, why did that seem like the best decision to make just now? And they'll tell me. And the curiosity, I mean, everything. I don't know, my background's kind of blurred, but honestly, I don't know if you can see this ink pen, right? So if somebody as an adult, you say, "What's this?" They say, "Oh, it's an ink pen." And then they know what it is and they know what it's for, right? There's all curiosity is gone. When a baby or a little person sees this ink pen, it's filled with infinite curiosity. So they say, "Well, what is this? I don't know what this is. Can I eat this?" Which is normally the first things they want to take things in, and they're always trying to take things in and always curious and being in wonder about everything around them. So that if I said, "Well, what do you think it is?" They go, and they can think about something. Maybe they saw an antenna. Is it an antenna? Can I
Mhm.
hold this in the air and then pick up radio stations? Like all sorts of things are available when a person is curious and wonder, and like making a practice of even looking at things that you think you know what they are, because a lot of our brains are designed for shortcuts, to try to be efficient. And so we're constantly looking for shortcuts. But if you choose not to take the shortcut and be curious about things that you have maybe lost all curiosity for, like the next time you come across something and your brain already tells you and you catch yourself with something telling you that you know what something is, just ask yourself, what is this about? What is this for? What could this be for? And just kind of keep asking questions.
I love that. So kind of tapping into our childlike curiosity rather than getting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I will warn folks, I have questions for days, but I want this to be open to folks in that if you have questions, put those in the Q&A and we'll get to those as well. But for now, it really struck me, the story you mentioned early on about your brother and then how he adopted that and how it shifted how
Yeah.
he sees the world. And I'm reminded of how so much that comes in entertainment, largely out of Hollywood, but beyond that too, especially when it comes to our history, really shapes
Mm-hmm.
how we see the world, even when it's inaccurate. And I'm curious,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to advocacy, what would you recommend folks when we have these stories that are so, mass produced and shifting our thinking? How do we as advocates shift folks back to reality?
Yeah, I mean, itself is an interesting word,
Oh,
because
true.
when a when a person, most of us think of reality, is deeply contextual.
Mm.
And so it's like if you like we one of the things I learned from learning Mandarin is there were at the time there was do you remember that there was a beer commercial where they would go, "What's up?" Do you
Oh
remember
my
those?
gosh. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. I hated
I didn't
those
remember it
commercials.
was for beer. I just remembered the
Yeah. So one of the fellow students in the class said to my Chinese teacher, "How do you say what's up in Chinese?" And the teacher said, "We don't say that." Like that was the answer. We don't say that. And so um, then the kid couldn't accept that the teacher is like, "We don't say that." So then he took the word for what in the word that is kind of like up, but it
Mhm.
wasn't really up. And he tried to make it still exist. So he was like, "Shima Sean, good." He tried to say, "What's up, brother?" So he kept saying that to the teacher. And the teacher was like, "Can you stop saying this to me?" We don't say this. And if he really wanted to engage with the teacher and
Mhm.
really know the teacher's reality, when the teacher said, "We don't
Mhm.
say that," that would have been the end of the story. And he wouldn't have continued to try to project his reality onto this other culture and this other person. He would have gotten curious and said, "Well, when we say what's up, it means," and gone deeper. Is there an equivalent to that? And
Mhm.
then been able to communicate from that place. But many a times, what we do is we take the way that we experience the life as reality. And so if we are the ground on which reality is built, everything else becomes not reality. So I
Mhm.
think what we have to do is be mindful that when we're advocating with people, not advocating for people, but advocating with people, is that the what we call reality is very nebulous, and no one can really grasp reality, because if we really could grasp reality, we would know everything about everyone over all times. No human can do that.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
system can contain that. Even the books that we tell are biased. So the most that we could do is be very present with whoever we're encountering, listen as openly as possible, try to create space in everything that we do so that we can make room for people, but then also be mindful to the limits of that space, because we also can't create infinite space. Because some people, like, I wouldn't sit with someone who says, "Oh, I hate people with gray hair in their beard, and I can't sit around them long enough without wanting to slap them." That could be their reality. I could talk to them on the phone about it. I'm not going to hang out with them in a room, so I have to
Mhm.
also know the limits of that
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that
And it
part of
sounds like
it.
being aware of how they're seeing things, like bringing that curiosity, and then also knowing like if it's something where a general understanding may be shaped by something that isn't how, isn't helpful, whether that's Hollywood or
Right.
elsewhere.
Yeah.
Shifting into that, I'm seeing a question here that relates where it's, where we create spaces as we let an audience participate in the storytelling process to fill in some of the blanks and draw people into the story. And in thinking about how to reach those who need certainty versus those who are a bit more adaptable, what changes would you recommend, if any?
That I would, again, it would go to being curious, because people say, or they think that they need certainty or they want certainty, but the reality is that level of reality where I said we can't not, the real reality is we can't have certainty. It's not really a thing. We can establish norms, we can establish agreements, and we can work with people that to help them show up. Like, to me, often the work that we're doing that seems to be creating uh, safety, or seems to be creating um, like certainty, it's only creating a greater invitation for that person to show up. But I have rarely met a person who says that they want certainty. If they were able to surgically remove their fear, they would let that fear be removed, because what they really want to do is show up as fully as possible. And so we expand the invitations, and continue to get curious so that they can show up. And then once they start to build the practice of showing up, they'll need less and less of what we call certainty or safety, or any of those things. It's just like everything else in life. I think we were talking about training wheels before. Like, when you first are riding a bike, you need the training wheels because you want certainty that you won't fall over. But once you start to establish the habit of riding the bike, you start to realize, hey, I don't think I need these training wheels anymore. I have achieved a certain level of balance that I can predict with some near accuracy that the chances of my falling have decreased, because I've put in enough work. I've continued to move. I've gotten balance. I've understand momentum, those sorts of things. And I think that that's what people are really looking for. And unfortunately, in many instances, we have um, tried to overcompensate to create systems of that can make people feel some kind of certainty or some kind of safety, but it's an illusion. And so I think that it's important. You don't have to tell the person it's an illusion. I used to do that. I used to tell people, like, once I realized, I would be like, man, what's wrong with you? It's an illusion. Snap out of it. And that was my type 8 Enneagram challenger.
Mhm.
But I've learned more to just kind of figure out, like, well, what do you need to feel like you can show up more fully? Will this help you to show up more fully? Will this help you to show up more fully? We can do that, but with the intention and hope that at some point they'll be able to let go of certain elements of the that need for that invitation,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
And I love that. And when we were talking about training wheels, I had shared that I learned how to ride a bike by inadvertently having the training wheels be lopsided. And so I could find
Hmm.
that balance, but there was always something, when if I leaned too far either way, it caught me. And I think about that with, if there's a community around us, those who are closest to
Hmm.
us can catch us even as we're learning to do something that's, really challenging and navigating all the stories that we have out there. And I want to acknowledge here, we're throwing really tough questions at you, and I've got one more, and then we've got another one in the
Hmm.
Q&A. But I'm reminded when you mentioned the statistic that you grew up with, say, telling
Hmm.
you like here are two paths, and neither one of them sound at all appealing. I was reminded years ago of working with a colleague who was a young Black woman and learned about statistics about Black maternal health. And I knew, from conversation with her, how heavily that was weighing. And it strikes me, in advocacy, a lot of what we talk about are the individual stories and then looking at the larger statistics. And as we're getting into those statistics, how do we balance the reality, and I'm trying to avoid that word now that we talked about reality, but how do we avoid the facts and maintain hope? I mean, maybe we're at 80% of this something, but we want to bring it to less. We want, there's, I'm not sure if that question makes sense, but how can we have the factual and also, keep hope in, make space for hope in there?
Yeah. So one of my many thousands of jobs, that's an exaggeration. Many of my jobs
Fairly.
is I sold cars for a little bit when I got out of the military. And one of the things they taught us was that facts tell and stories sell. And so the facts can state something like when we talk about, like, okay, this car has these safety features, blah, 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 blah. But if we wanted the person to be encouraged to purchase the car, we had to say, oh, well, where do you plan on going with this car? Are you going to use it for your commute? Are you going to go on a vacation with your family? Are you guys going to go on a road trip? And the stories of the future possibilities would be something that would be more attractive to the person purchasing the vehicle than just like, you can say a safety feature, but it doesn't become real until you tell a story. And I tend to not tell stories that are fear based if I can help it. Sometimes you have to, but I think that it's that balance of understanding facts tell and stories sell. So if you tell a story about how the facts came to be, and that's the only story you have, then it's just going to be a duplication of the same information. But if you can say, this is how we got here, but this is where we want to be, what is a story that we can tell about where we want to be? What kind of vision can we hold? Like I said about being future informed indigeneity, another term I'm using is vision keepers. I'm just trying to come up with tools for folks to locate themselves in this comprehensive plan in Boulder. And being a vision keeper, if you help people find an identity that they can ground themselves in a hopeful future, the facts, yes, that's the ground that the rocket takes off from. Like, this is where we are. Where we want to be is up here somewhere. So we need to understand where we are, but we also have to have a greater story of where we want to be.
Oh, and that is a beautiful place to end today. We've got two questions we will address in the follow-up email. Thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Pedro, for all of your insights. We will put links in the chat to stay in touch with you. I think a lot of folks had questions and would love, we'll include all the materials that you mentioned in the follow-up, including how to figure out your own Enneagram.
Mhm.
If, uh, We'll also put a link in the chat. Next week is June already, and our June webinar is the beginning of the month. And so we're going back to back here, and we'd love to have you join us for an inspiring example of effective advocacy at the local level. When you leave the webinar, a 15-minute, oh my goodness, 15-second poll, 15 minutes would be a lot to ask, 15-second poll will pop up. Please be a helper and share your feedback. We really value your thoughts, and you'll help us shape future webinars. With that, thank you again, Pedro. This was a joy. Be well, everyone. Do good, stay healthy and hopeful, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.